This is a story about love, loss, and the long road back to light. My son Ryder was born still after what seemed to be a healthy, full-term, uneventful pregnancy. Nothing prepared us for that day or for everything that followed. In this podcast, I'll take you through the moments leading up to his passing, the immediate aftermath, and the reality of learning how to survive something that feels impossible to survive. I'll show you how I slowly found my footing again, how joy eventually made its way back into my life, and where I am today. This is not medical advice, and I'm not a therapist or healthcare professional. These are my experiences, my perspectives, and my truth. If you are walking a similar path, I encourage you to seek guidance from your care providers and find what works best for you. But this is my story, and if you're here, I hope that somewhere within it, you find a little bit of hope. Hey everyone, welcome back. If you've been listening to the first few episodes, you've heard us talk about the delivery room, the hour leading up to Ryder's birth, and the moments that followed when everything changed. But the truth is our story doesn't actually start in that delivery room. Our story starts months earlier. It starts during Anne's anatomy scans. There are certain images that are supposed to be taken to fully complete an anatomy scan. These images are images that doctors rely on to confirm that everything is developing the way that it should. And these images were simply never taken. However, Ryder's scan was signed off as complete anyway. And without the images of the cord insertion, without the follow-up care that should have changed, Ryder's outcome was already predetermined. From that moment forward, Ryder's outcome was likely going to be his passing. And at the time, we had no idea. Like most expecting parents, we trusted the process. We trusted the system. We trusted that if something was wrong, someone would tell us, but they didn't. And that's something that we will continue to unpack more throughout the podcast, because our story isn't just about grief. It's also about awareness, about maternal and fetal health, and about how systems people trust every day can sometimes fail families in ways that change lives forever. The first few episodes focused on the end of that story, the delivery room, the drive home from the hospital, the moment it hit us that we were leaving without our son, the funeral home, the medical examiner, the autopsy, and then the different types of therapy Anne and I tried just to survive those early weeks. Those first couple episodes were all about shock, about the moments when the brain is trying to process something it simply wasn't built to understand. Today's episode picks up in the weeks that followed. After Ryder died, there were a lot of decisions that technically needed to be made. But the truth is, Anne and I weren't really making them. Memorial services, burial decisions, timing, locations, all of that was on hold. And honestly, we were okay with that, because postponing those decisions meant we didn't fully have to face them yet. One thing we did know right away was that we didn't want Ryder buried somewhere that we wouldn't be forever. Life moves, jobs move, cities change. We were not sure we were going to be in the Southeast forever. And the thought of our son being buried somewhere we might not live someday just did not sit right with us. So we knew right away that Ryder would be cremated. Outside of that, we really didn't have a plan. And we didn't have to, at least not right away, because Ryder was still not back from the medical examiner. The funeral home did not have him yet. And while we waited for the autopsy to be completed to get that news back, decisions just didn't have to be made. And that created this strange pause in time. Our son had died, but nothing had happened yet. And it was almost as if our grief was sitting in neutral. During this time, something happened that was both beautiful, a little disgusting, and honestly, really eye-opening. Our Iowa circle of friends and family, they arranged for an urn to be donated for Ryder. It came from a group of monks at a monastery just outside of Dubuque. Someone had connected the dots and said, let's do this meaningful thing for Nick and Ann and for Ryder. And so they donated an urn, and it really was beautiful. Not just the urn itself, but the gesture behind it. when you lose a child, when you lose anyone in your life, people desperately want to help. And so they show up in ways that sometimes make sense, sometimes don't. Because most of the time, people don't know how to process a loss, especially the loss of a child, a loss of that magnitude. There are no casseroles for this kind of grief. There are no sympathy cards that say the right thing. But something about that moment, about the urn and that being donated, struck me in a different way. Because for the first time, it made me wonder, how often does this happen? How often are monasteries, churches, hospitals, funeral homes, community groups that already have systems in place so that things like this can be donated and paid for? How often are babies passing away that these services exist? And at the time, I think this was just a passing thought. But looking back now and knowing what I know, this was really the first glimpse into something way bigger than that. The reality that infant loss, stillbirth, maternal and fetal health complications happen far more often than most people realize, and often quietly, often without conversation, often without people ever knowing someone in their life has experienced it. And we're going to dive into that quite a bit in this podcast, because the maternal and fetal health challenges in the United States are real, and they are bigger than most people realize. But at that moment, we were just parents that were grieving, realizing that there were people out there that were supporting families like ours. So the urn was sent to us, and it was brought to the funeral home where we lived, and we waited. We waited for our son to be returned to the funeral home so that he could come back home to us. And while all of this was happening, life kept moving. My grandmother passed away, and normally that would be a huge loss. But in the middle of everything that we were already carrying, it almost felt second tier, which is not fair to the wonderful, beautiful woman that my grandmother was. But I was just not prepared to process stacked grief in that way. But what my grandmother's passing really was a catalyst for something that Ann and I had been avoiding, which was planning services. Because now it meant that whether we wanted to or not, we were going back to the Midwest. We were going back to Chicago, and it made sense. If we were going to be home for my grandmother's services, it was probably time to plan Ryder services too, where all of our family was going to be. And, you know, it wasn't months and months of no progress, but this was several weeks. It was almost a month after Ryder had passed. So the decision was made to start planning those services. And Anna and I talked about whether Ryder services should be in Illinois or Iowa. Illinois is where my family is, but I think ultimately Iowa made more sense. Ann's family had deeper roots there. They had always been there. My family had moved around, south side, north side, a little bit more. And so Ann's roots were deeper, and there were more connections. There were more places where services could be held, and it just made more sense. When you're going through this type of grief, these types of logistical decisions can be really overwhelming. Phone calls, planning, it all feels impossible. So you lean on the places where that support and that comfort already exists. But during this time, there was still one huge uncertainty. Ryder was with the medical examiner. They were performing the autopsy. There wasn't really a timeline for that. And so what if Ryder wasn't back in time? And so this was a huge point of stress and anxiety for Ann and I. because that timeline was unclear. And then the cremation timeline on top of that was more structured, but it wasn't, a day or 2 day turnaround time. And so when you're planning something like your son's services, you want to have as much in your control as you possibly can. And the most important factor, our son, and him coming back to us, was completely out of our control. And that sat with us constantly. Thankfully, everything worked out. Ryder was returned to the funeral home. His cremation was set, and Ryder was finally able to go home to us. The day before we were supposed to leave for Illinois for my grandmother's funeral, actually, is when Ryder was able to be returned. And it was such an incredible weight lifted for Ann and I. But there was something else that happened that I did not expect. When I went to pick up Ryder from the funeral home in his urn, this was the first time I rode in the car with my son. That realization didn't hit me until the moment that it happened. And it's not what you would have expected, at least not for me. Having my son in the car, even though it was just his urn, you go into dad mode. And the first thing I did is I buckled the seatbelt around the urn, just like any parent would for any of their children. And I drove as cautiously as I ever had in my entire life. Every stoplight, every turn, every mile, every foot on the gas, every step on the brake. There was an added sense of, I don't know if it's urgency, safety. I don't know what the right word is in the moment, speaking through this for the very first time. I've never actually talked about this. But my son was sitting next to me. And I was protecting him the only way I still could. Because even in loss, the instinct to protect your child never goes away. And this is something that I have carried with me for the last several years since his passing, telling this story, this podcast, writing his chapter in Celebrating Angels, which is a collaborative anthology of parents telling their children's stories from a group we work with called No Foot Too Small, which we will also get into heavily in some of the episodes during this podcast. But getting back to the story, that drive home and then that drive to Illinois for my grandmother's funeral, my son's safety and having him in that urn packed in the car with us. Ann and I both felt it. The anxiety around, what if something happens? What if we're in an accident? What will happen to the urn? All of those things. The anxiety around what we felt in those moments and on that car ride was, I imagine, very much similar to the anxiety a new parent would have felt the first time driving their child home from the hospital. And I will say, years removed, that anxiety is still there. Every time we leave to go on a trip, or we're away from the home for a long period of time, those thoughts, what if something happens? What if there's a fire? What if something happens and that urn is destroyed? Ryder is gone forever. Those things are with us still to this day. And they started in the moment that I picked him up from the funeral home. Jumping forward, we arrive in Illinois for my grandmother's services. And it's odd. I still don't know how this happened, but there's confusion. Some family friends thought that we were actually there for Ryder services and not my grandmother's. So people were approaching us unsure of what they were supposed to say. They were offering condolences for Ryder. They were telling us they thought that they were at services for Ryder. Others were there specifically for my grandmother. And then were also offering condolences for our son as well. Some were just hugging us because they didn't know what else to do. And honestly, I don't blame anyone for the confusion. I don't know how it happened. People see obituaries almost side by side. I don't know how this happened in Illinois, but it did. I would say grief is confusing, especially when it overlaps. And it can get ugly. It can get dirty. I've seen this in other aspects of my life when we're stacking grief. Don't want to get into that in these episodes because it has nothing to do with Ryder. But something else stuck with me that weekend. A lot of friends showed up to pay respects, and it meant a lot. But if I'm being totally honest, and this podcast is here for brutal honesty, I'm telling Ryder's story and I'm going to tell it exactly how it happened. It also hurt a little because I heard things like, we can't make it to Iowa next weekend because, our son has baseball, or we have to work. And that was incredibly difficult. And in my mind, the first thing I thought was, yeah, it's great. Your son gets to play baseball. My son never will. And quite frankly, you could miss a game or a tournament or whatever to acknowledge the fact that my son was here. Before this instance at the funeral home and having some of these conversations with friends and family on my side, this is my story from me, not Ann's family, not Ann's friends. This is my story. Up until this moment, if something like this would have happened to with any of my friends, I think there's very little that could have kept me from showing up. When I was just moved back from the Southeast after college, I had a friend whose father was murdered during a home break-in. And I was just starting off in my career, didn't have anything to show for it, barely any money. And I dropped everything to go back for several days for services, to be there with my friends, with the family. I couldn't imagine not showing up when there was this type of a loss. And here I was hearing excuses and knowing that other people's lives were moving forward. They were going on with life, and I just wasn't. And I know schedules are hard, but again, I just kept thinking, like, my son will never play baseball. And those comments hurt way more than anyone intended. There was something else that really hit me hard with Ryder services once we got to those in Iowa, which is that not a single one of my cousins on my side of the family came to Ryder services. Not a single one. And that was a major emotional blow because, again, like, I could not imagine not showing up for something like that if the roles were reversed. In fact, up until this point, I showed up for all of these types of events. Even if it was, an uncle of my cousin I wasn't related to, I took off work, I showed up. So I was angry. And I was, really, really angry. And I held on to that anger for a long time. And we will get into that and about letting go of some of that anger in a later episode. But I can say this now. Holding on to that anger for as long as I did without saying anything about it to some of those people only hurt myself. The only one that was held back by that was me. And again, we'll go into this in another episode, but I have forgiven. And I've had some conversations around that forgiveness with some of my family, and those were really healing moments, really powerful moments, and I'm glad we've had them. But it still doesn't take away from the anger and the pain that I felt in that moment. So that brings me to what I really wanted to focus on in this episode, which is showing up. Because when someone experiences loss like this, there is nothing perfect to say. None. There is no sentence that fixes it, that takes the pain away, that reverses the loss. There's no quote that makes it better. No sympathy card that makes the pain smaller. It doesn't exist. So if you're someone listening to this and you've ever worried about saying the wrong thing, let me tell you that it's okay to say the wrong thing. So many people said the wrong thing. One of the things we got all of the time was, and I think this happens mainly with miscarriage, infertility, stillbirth. At least you can try again. And that was another quote or saying that we would hear all the time. That really stuck. Like, that one hurt, but we know it was well intended. My response or my thought process through all of that was, this is my son. This is my child. Like, this is, I didn't miss a game-winning field goal in the fourth quarter. I didn't miss a free throw. I didn't strike out in a baseball game. This was my son. So there was no trying again. This son was gone. And so while there's no perfect thing to say, I will say, like, there are bad things. There are things that you shouldn't say or you should avoid saying to someone, but I will tell you with 100% certainty, you can say the wrong thing if it's well intended and you're showing up, and it's going to be okay. And now I don't want to speak for everyone because that may not be the case for every person, but I can say this from my experience, how I feel about it as the dad in this situation, in this moment. Just show up, man. Like, that is the one thing that you can do, regardless of how terrible of something you might say, how stupid you may sound. Just show up. Because again, there's no do-over. This was our child. And so more than what you say, it's the showing up that matters. Because just like there is no do-over with our son, there's no do-over for missing the services, for not showing up in a way that you intended because it's uncomfortable or it's unnatural. And I get that loss is hard. And especially out of order loss, like, this is so awkward. It's so tragic. It's so uncomfortable. Our parents didn't talk about these things. Our grandparents certainly didn't talk about these things: pregnancy loss, stillbirth, infant loss. I have an aunt who died at 2 years old, 60 years ago. And when we would bring this up with my grandmother, her response was, sorry for the language, but why are we bringing up that stupid shit? And people just aren't equipped for these conversations. I've said it several times in this episode, but we have to change that stigma. That's what this podcast is for. It's what so many groups are for. It's what people are trying to do all over the world. We need to start talking about these things because they're often carried quietly. And so when we were facing this, and when people face this today, we're facing this and walking this on new ground. People are finally starting to have the conversation. And so what I can tell you as part of this conversation is just show up. And I will say one of the pleasant surprises during this time for Ann and I is who actually showed up, because it's not always who you expect. Sometimes there are people that are secondary characters in your life. They're coworkers. They are side characters in the everyday. And sometimes those are the people that you have no expectation from that will change your life for the better forever. Because in our situation, some of the people that stepped forward completely surprised us. And, one of the things I don't want to do in this podcast is say names directly. But in this space, in this situation, Nikki and AD, you changed our lives. And it started with how you showed up in this loss for us and how you continue to show up for Ryder every day, every opportunity. And there are people, friends, family, all over the place that show up for us and show up for our son in amazing ways. But if we got one thing from losing Ryder that is beautiful and special in every way possible, it is really that Ryder brought Nikki and AD into our lives in a way that maybe would not have happened otherwise. And so we are grateful for that gift that our son gave us, and we are grateful, eternally grateful, for how Nikki and AD showed up and continue to show up for us. Because again, showing up is all that matters. It doesn't need to be gifts. It doesn't need to be flowers. It doesn't need to be food. Please do not bring people food. Ask what is needed, because that is the go-to. Everybody is going to bring a dish, a casserole, whatever. And it is great until you have no more room for it, which happened in our situation. It's somewhat funny to look back on, the number of casseroles that were frozen. We didn't cook for weeks, and it was great. But that is another thing I can say about showing up is ask, because I hope that people in this situation, when prompted, can tell you what they need. I know that is something that Ann and I learned very quickly in our loss and our grief journey, is that we needed to tell people how we wanted them to show up, because some people weren't showing up, and we took control of those that were supporting us around us in at least how they showed up for us. Again, we were in the Southeast. People don't talk about this at all, really, anywhere. But in the Bible Belt, in the Southeast, where we have Southern gentlemen and debutantes and all of the things, all of the Southern stereotypes, this is uncomfortable ground. And I remember some of our best friends at the time and still to this day, they were very uncomfortable speaking to us in this space. What do we need? Where we had conversations that were so direct because they wanted to show up and they were trying very hard, and they were wonderful people, and they're great. They're still staples in our lives. But there were times where we needed to correct them and say, nope, this is what we needed. This is what we need moving forward. And if you can't do that, then just don't show up, because we're telling you this is not what you think or what you're comfortable with. This is what we need. And so we took control of those conversations, but showing up is so important. Again, there are wrong things to say and there are wrong things to do, but if it's well-intended, my hope is that people can see that and then correct it. And I know that is something that Anna and I did consistently. Back to some of the individuals that didn't show up in our lives. There were individuals at work that I worked with for years. Literally, our desks were 3 inches apart for multiple years. And not a single word of acknowledgement in the loss of our son. And that sticks with me to this day. And some of these people I put in what I call the yeah but category. Up until my loss, I had heard things, I had seen things, how people were being treated, how people were being talked about by some of these people. And I gave them a pass because it was a yeah, but it's not about me, or yeah, but it's not that bad. And then it happened to me. After Ryder died, not a single word, not one. And that shocked me. But it also made me think about something that, a quote that I had heard in passing over the years. It was never directed at me, or maybe it was, I just don't know. But a quote by Maya Angelou that I have come to live by, which is, when someone shows you who they are, believe them the first time. And so that is another gift, I guess, in showing up and in this process that Ryder did give me, is that the yeah buts, I cut them out. They're out of my life. If you can't show up consistently for not just me, but for those around you, I can't genuinely consider you a great or even a good person. So those individuals that are yeah but individuals in my life, they're not in my life anymore. Because when someone shows you who they are, believe them. So in my journey, it's come to my attention or my belief that grief has a strange way of revealing people. It clarifies relationships, and it shows you who really is in your corner. And sometimes it introduces you to people who can become incredibly important in your life moving forward. Because again, some of the most meaningful relationships Anna and I have today started really forming during this time. Because the people who show up for you when you're at your lowest, they matter. In the next episode, we'll talk about Ryder's memorial service and what it felt like to stand in a room full of people celebrating a life that lasted only a few hours, but forever changed us. So thank you for listening. And if you've experienced loss, I hope you know this, that you do not walk through it alone. You just need to find your people. Thank you.